lay awake, faintly aware of the sound of my wife breathing. Mostly, I had my ears attuned to noises coming from outside. I listened for footsteps, for whispered words, for the slide of a pump-action shotgun or the metallic sound of a cartridge pushed into a breech. But I heard nothing of the sort. It gave me no comfort. When we first moved in, I hadn't considered getting a security system. I didn't think we would need one. That was part of the charm, the safety of small-town America. How wrong I was. Even now, things had progressed to the point where I wasn't sure if a security system would do much good. I was beginning to think that the only thing to do was move. We hadn't even been in the house for a month, and already I was considering moving. I was scared, but being scared made me mad. The two emotions warred against each other, making sleep an impossible task. I snapped up in bed at the sound of something hitting the side of the house. I'd scarcely taken a breath when another, more pronounced and dread-inducing sound came from downstairs. It was the shattering of glass. Not looking, I reached over and grabbed my wife, who was already moving.
"Was that a window breaking?"
she asked. "Get up," I said, throwing the covers off and racing for the door. From the back of the house came another thud. As I got to my daughter's room, I heard one of the back windows shatter. There was more than one attacker. They were on both sides of the house. My daughter started bawling before I even got the door open. I raced to her side and grabbed her up. At 9, she was still small enough for me to do so. I heard Vivian's footsteps behind me as she ran down the hall. Trisha held against my chest. I stepped into the hallway. The thumping and crashing were coming from all sides now. Fear shortened my breath and flushed my muscles with tension as I realized there had to be at least 6 or 7 of them out there. I was sure all our downstairs windows were now broken as I ran to the hall bathroom and ducked inside. Vivian came in behind me and slammed the door, locking it. We were on the 2nd floor, and there was only one small window above the bathtub. I pulled the shower curtain across, hoping it would keep us from getting showered in glass if one of them managed to hit the window with a stone or brick or whatever it was they were throwing. Vivian and I got down, backs against the bathroom cabinet below the sink, and huddled together. We wrapped a sobbing Trisha in a protective embrace and listened as the attack continued outside. There was a nightlight above the sink in the bathroom. We hadn't turned on the light for fear it would alert our attackers to our location in the house. In the light cast by the nightlight, I looked at my beautiful wife and daughter, their faces distorted by fear. Their normally rich, dark skin was ashen, save where tears had cut dark lines down their faces. Yes, I was afraid in that moment. Afraid they would come into the house and kill us. Afraid they would take away the 2 most important people in my life. But mostly, I was mad. I was filled with a rage that ran so deep and so red, it seemed to create a halo of hate in my vision. But when I heard a crash that could only be the front door breaking in, the fear took over. I did nothing but cower in my own house, waiting for our attackers to come upstairs and do whatever they pleased to us.
"It'll be nice to have some new faces in town,"
the real estate agent said as I looked around the living room. I shot him a glance.
If you buy the place, of course,"
he said, realizing his assumption. Then again, it was a fair assumption. It was the 2nd time I'd looked at the house. Vivian and Trisha were back in Atlanta, busy with work for Vivian and school for Trisha. But the first time I looked at it, I took a video of the place and sent it to Viv. She and Trisha watched it that night and said they thought it was great, but that the ultimate decision was up to me. Vivian and I had already done online research into the town of 1,100 people. The schools were supposed to be good, with small class sizes and decent after-school programs. The only concern we had was that it was a pretty homogeneous place. I hadn't seen a single person of color while I had been in the town of Raynor. Although I looked like your average white guy, I was really half Hispanic. Vivian was black, and my daughter looked very much like her mother, with only slightly lighter skin. I had kind of envisioned her growing up around people of all ethnic backgrounds, not just one group, whether it be white, black, Hispanic, or any of the other groups that called America home. But in the end, I thought Raynor was perfect for us. The house was great, on a couple of acres of land that we could use for gardening and enjoying the outdoors. The town seemed quaint and quiet, so the lack of diversity wasn't a big enough reason to not buy the house. Once I was done looking the whole place over for the second time, I stepped over to the real estate agent whose name was Buchanan. He struck me as an all-American type. He had fair skin and light hair. His eyes were bright blue. He'd probably played football at Raynor High School.
I'd like to make an offer,
I said.
That's great, Mr. Larson,
he said, shaking my hand briefly.
What kind of name is Larson, anyway? I think it's Scandinavian,
I said, smiling.
Of course, my father's family has been in the country for several generations. Of course,
Buchanan said, smiling back.
Well, that's just great. I'm excited to meet your wife and daughter. Do you have a picture of them?
I thought this an odd request. Of course I had pictures of them on my phone, but I didn't really feel comfortable sharing them with this guy who I barely knew.
No,
I said.
I'm sure you'll meet them soon enough.
There was a flicker of something in Buchanan's eyes, but he raised his hands in apology.
Sorry, overstepping my bounds. I'm just glad we're getting a nice American family in here. Me too. I'm sure we'll love living in this beautiful little town.
I didn't see Buchanan again until it was time to finalize the paperwork, and that was a brief meeting at his office in the small downtown area. He was as nice as ever, and so were the people I saw around town. Many of them waved or smiled at me as I walked along. It was a strange feeling, seeing as how it was uncommon for people in Atlanta to say hi to strangers. When the sale was officially through, I was already back in Georgia, making plans for the move out of our apartment. We left the ATL at the end of the month, driving up to our new house in the southeastern corner of Iowa. The movers we hired would meet us there with our possessions in a few days. When we came into town and stopped at the real estate office to get the keys to the house, Vivian and Trisha were busy commenting on how the town looked so perfect. It was like something out of a movie, Trisha said. I beamed with pride. It had taken many years of hard work and saving money, but we were finally going to live the American dream. Both Viv and I had remote jobs, so we could work from home, which meant being around to raise our daughter together. It really was a dream come true. Right up until the three of us got out of the car in the parking lot, just a block away from Buchanan's office. I was immediately aware of the unfriendly eyes on us. Faces peered out of shop windows as we moved down the street. People driving by turned their heads to stare. The people we passed didn't smile, nor did they wave, despite my wife and daughter smiling politely and raising their hands in greeting. It was like night and day from when I'd come by myself. Vivian and I shared a look as we got to the real estate office. I just shrugged. I had no idea what the problem was. Only that's not exactly true. There was only one difference I could see. Well, two to be exact. And they were standing next to me in front of the office door. Inside the office, we were greeted coldly by the receptionist I knew as Mrs. Buchanan, the real estate agent's wife.
I'll get Fred,
she said without preamble, standing up from behind the desk and hustling into the back of the office. Moments later, Fred Buchanan came out, eyes wide as they traveled over my wife and daughter. He seemed whiter than usual, as if he'd gone pale.
Mr. Larson,
he said, not offering to shake my hand. He had a set of keys in one hand, and he gave them over to me. Then he turned around and walked back toward the door he'd come through not even a minute ago. As he went through the door, he glanced at my family, looking ill. Then he was gone, shutting the door behind him and leaving us in the lobby, dumbstruck at the treatment.
What the hell just happened?
Vivian asked.
Why do I feel like we're not wanted here?
I could say nothing. I only swallowed noisily and ushered them back outside. By the time we got to the house, the mood was subdued. We stepped inside our new home and looked around at the barren walls and the cavernous rooms. The house had somehow lost all its charm. It was nothing more than an empty shell, and even inside of it, I felt the same coldness we'd just experienced in town. Days passed. The movers came and went. and we attempted to settle in. The house was on a back road where the other homes were distant enough that we couldn't see them through the trees. Our driveway was long enough that we could only see a glimpse of the road from the house. We had no visitors. No neighbors came over to say hello. Then again, we hadn't even seen our neighbors at all, unless you count the flash of a vehicle passing on the road. After about a week in the house, with all our furniture and other belongings inside, Vivian and I began to feel that we had overreacted when going to get the keys from Buchanan. I blamed myself. I had come back from Raynor before the move with stories of friendly people smiling and waving. I had made a big deal out of it, so our expectations had been high when we all piled out of the car in that parking lot. And when we didn't get the reception we'd been expecting, we assumed the worst. Besides, in a town where, as far as I had seen, there were no other black people, one could expect a little bit of trepidation. It was unfortunate, but it was the way things were in some places, apparently.
Give them time,
Vivian said when we were talking about it.
We'll win them over.
It helped that when I went for groceries at the local market the day after we arrived, I didn't have anyone scowling at me or giving me the evil eye. Then again, I didn't have anyone smiling or waving at me either. I was greeted with casual indifference for the most part. The clerk at the market was polite, sticking to the normal cashier-customer interaction. By the time we'd been in the house for 10 days, we were starting to feel pretty good about the move, which was a relief. We'd timed the move so it would happen just after Trisha got out of school. We didn't want to interrupt her education. So by the time we got settled in the house, summer was in full swing, which meant that she was home all day with her parents. And like any 9-year-olds, she was going stir-crazy and driving us crazy in the process. So one fine Friday morning while I was working on ductwork blueprints for the design firm I worked for, Vivian and Trisha went out to do some exploring around town. They were gone for no more than an hour when I heard the garage door go up. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I heard the door to the garage open, and the unmistakable sound of my daughter crying reached my ears. I got up from my desk in my downstairs den/office and hurried out to see what the problem was.
What's wrong?
I asked, seeing Vivian walking behind Trisha, hands on her shoulders.
There was an incident at the playground,
Vivian said.
A couple of the kids ganged up on Trish. Ganged up?
I asked.
What does that mean?
Vivian sat our daughter down on the couch and gave her a tissue. The sobbing was slowing, and Trisha nodded when Vivian asked her if she was okay. Then my wife came over to me and pulled me down the hall by the arm. When we were out of earshot, she told me what had happened at the playground.
They threw sand in her face and called her the N-word. What?
I shouted.
Shh,
Vivian said, gripping my arm tighter.
She's already upset enough as it is. They called her. You heard them call her that?
I asked, barely able to control my voice.
Oh, I heard it. I had to keep from slapping one of the kids. He just kept saying it over and over again. How old were these kids?
I asked.
Her age?
Vivian shook her head, eyes filled with despair.
They were teenagers, and there were several adults nearby. They didn't do anything. They just stood there, watching the whole thing. Jesus Christ! What is wrong with these people? That's not all, Michael. The adults, they were smiling.
I wanted to drive to the park and see if the offenders were still there. Vivian managed to talk me down, insisting that we needed to turn the other cheek. She said it was best to not let them know we would be intimidated by a couple of teenagers. We had a long chat with Trisha that night, making sure she knew it wasn't her fault in any way, shape, or form. When we went to bed, I lay awake for a long time, thinking about what to do. Moving again was the most obvious solution, but it would take months. Besides, I didn't want to move, perhaps because it would seem like giving up. As my anger lingered, burbling under the surface, I knew that it wouldn't let me give up so easily. Little did I know that things were about to get a whole lot worse. Several more days passed without incident. Granted, we didn't venture into town during that time. Trisha asked if we could get a dog, and I didn't think it was such a bad idea, but there was no fence around the yard, so we'd have to get one installed if we decided to get a dog for Trisha. We were running low on some essentials, so we all loaded up into the car and headed for the market in town. It was the middle of the afternoon, and the downtown area wasn't all that busy yet, but as we entered the market, I felt people staring at us. We collected a shopping cart and moved into the small grocery store, Vivian with a list in hand. I heard the automatic door open behind us and glanced over my shoulder to see a tall man with slicked back dark hair dressed in a fancy gray suit. A woman who looked like a done-up housewife from the 50s or 60s walked beside him. They were good-looking and middle-aged. The man glanced over at the 3 registers to see who was working. He waved hello to a balding man, who I took for the manager, and the teenage clerk next to him. The balding man didn't return the greeting. Instead, he inclined his head toward my family, as if to alert the newcomers to our presence. The tall man swiveled his head toward us, the mirth leaving his face as his eyes landed on my mixed-race family. Unable to help myself, I stopped pushing the cart and turned to face the man, and I stared at him. He and the woman stared right back. Finally, he broke contact and smiled sadly, shaking his head. The woman whispered something in his ear as they grabbed a basket. They moved toward the opposite side of the store, faces serious.
What was that?
Vivian asked. I don't know, I said, turning back to push the cart. We decided to split up to get the shopping done as quickly as possible. Vivian and Trisha went off to get a few things while I moved toward the produce section with the cart. Music played over the speaker system, just loud enough to be audible. Otherwise, the store was pretty quiet. So when I heard the sound of a slap from the middle of the store, I was immediately on edge. Then a male voice shouted, "Bitch!" Leaving the cart where it was, I hurried toward the source of the noise. As I glanced down the cereal aisle, I saw the tall man with one hand around my wife's throat, the other holding her right wrist aloft, as if he'd caught it when she tried to slap him. The woman was there, looking down the aisle at me. Some 5 yards behind her, Trisha stood, stock still in the middle of the aisle, tears in her eyes. The anger I'd been carrying with me since that day Vivian and Trisha came home from the park morphed into a seething red rage. I moved down the aisle, grabbing a plastic bottle of syrup from a shelf.
Adam?
The woman said, clearly trying to get the man's attention, but the man wasn't listening. He was leaning in, whispering something in Vivian's ear. But my wife still had a free hand, and whatever he said to her prompted her to use it. She swung her left hand up and open palm smacked him in the side of the head. His face twisted in a sneer, and he tightened his grip on her throat, pulling her toward him and then slamming her back into the shelves. Boxes of cereal tumbled down and hit the floor.
Adam!
The woman called, blocking my way down the aisle. I shoved her aside easily, sending her sprawling into the shelves to my right. The commotion got Adam's attention, and he looked up just in time to see me raising the bottle of syrup, but not in time to react. I slammed the bottom of the bottle into his face. His nose broke with a crunch, and he released Vivian, stepping back to fight. But I was crowding in tight, and I slammed the bottle into his face again and again. Then I dropped the bottle and tripped him to the ground. I got both my hands around his throat and started to squeeze. And if I hadn't been pulled off him by a couple of store employees, I probably would have killed him right there in front of my wife and daughter. Looking back on it, I wish I had.
You really did a number on our poor mayor,
The sheriff said to me through the bars of the jail cell.
Broke his nose, knocked out a couple of teeth. Baby even gave him a concussion.
I sat in the cell on an uncomfortable metal bunk, looking at the good old boy sheriff. He was in his 50s, with a considerable gut and bushy mutton chops on his cheeks. He was a stout guy with a pinkish face and sausage fingers, and he was talking to me like we were old friends.
He assaulted my wife,
I said.
I don't care if he's the mayor or the goddamn president of the United States. He was choking her. For all I know, he would have killed her. Well now, Mr. Larson, there seems to be some doubt as to the truth of your story. The way Mrs. Johnson tells it, your wife assaulted him and he was just defending himself.
I figured Mrs. Johnson was the mayor's wife, and I wasn't surprised to hear that her version of events was far from mine. Although that didn't keep me from feeling a strangling sense of dismay.
Why would my wife attack a man she's never even met before?
I asked.
It makes no sense. Well, you never know what those people are capable of, do you?
I stood up and stepped toward the bars, looking down into the shorter man's eyes. I had my jaw clenched so tight it was giving me a headache. Sheriff Walsh smiled faintly as he looked at me. He was trying to goad me into doing something stupid. Either that, or he was just letting me know where he stood on the whole thing. Maybe both. I stepped back.
If that's the case, if she did assault him, why haven't you arrested her? If we did that, who would look after your daughter? You should be happy she's not in there with you. Besides, we're waiting to hear back from the mayor. He may yet want to press charges against your wife. We'll see. There's plenty of time.
I sat back down and gripped my head in my hands.
What are you charging me with?
Sheriff Walsh sighed.
Why don't you just sit tight and think about the choices you've made? I suggest focusing on your choice of spouse. All this could have been avoided if you hadn't married a monkey.
Clenching my fists at my temples, I listened as the mayor walked out to the front of the station, chuckling to himself. Time passed. The sun went down outside. They never let me have my phone call. And although I had no idea what time of night it was when the sheriff came back, I knew it had to be late.
Time to go,
the man said. He had a deputy with him, and I thought there was a family resemblance there. Maybe a son or a nephew.
Where?
I asked, standing up.
Are you letting me go home? Turn around and place your hands through the gap,
the sheriff said.
Where are we going?
I asked again. Sheriff Walsh turned to the deputy.
Tase him,
he said. The deputy smiled as he pulled a taser from his tool belt and pointed it through the bars at me.
Wait,
I said.
Wait!
I stepped up to the gap in the bars, turned around, and stuck my hands through. I felt the cold kiss of metal as the man affixed a handcuff to my left wrist, but for some reason, he didn't attach it to my right. Suddenly, there was a hand on my back. He shoved me forward, hard, and I stumbled toward the metal bunk. Before I could get turned around, I heard a pop sound and then felt 2 sharp stabs in my back, followed by a symphony of pain. My muscles stiffened as electricity coursed through my body. I collapsed onto the bunk and then slid to the floor, unable to properly use my limbs. I came to rest on the cold concrete floor, face down. The cell door came open, and as soon as the electric shock faded away, I felt a knee settle on the back of my neck. I immediately found it hard to breathe. My hands were pulled behind my back and I was fully cuffed.
He tried to kill me,
Sheriff Walsh said from above me. It was his knee on the back of my neck.
He went for my gun. You saw it. Sure did,
the other man said.
Pulled out of the cuffs and went for your gun. He just wouldn't calm down. Kept talking crazy, like he was going to kill us all. Must be on something. Must be. Please,
I managed.
I can't breathe.
There was no response. Ragged black rings encroached on my vision. I felt lightheaded. I tried to kick my legs up, but the deputy quickly shoved them down and knelt on them. I couldn't move at all. I heard the sound of a door opening, and a woman's voice spoke urgently.
Sheriff, his lawyer's here. He's right outside, and he's making a big fuss. His lawyer?
The sheriff said.
Well, goddamn it. He just moved here. How would a lawyer get here so fast?
There was no answer. Suddenly, the sheriff lifted his knee from the back of my neck, allowing me to pull in a gasping breath. I rolled onto my back as the cell door closed. The sheriff, the deputy, and the woman left. Once again, I was alone in the holding area, and I was lucky to be alive. I think he would have killed me if you hadn't shown up, I said to my brother-in-law, Curtis. My voice was scratchy, and I rubbed the back of my neck as I talked. Curtis, who was driving us back to my house, shook his head.
Something isn't right here. They just let you go without any paperwork at all. I don't like it.
Although not a criminal attorney, Curtis was a lawyer, and he was Vivian's brother, so I trusted him implicitly. He was a good guy. Shortly after he'd escorted me out of the police station into his rental car, he told me that one of his clients had a private jet. Directly after I'd been arrested at the grocery store, Vivian had called him, and he dropped everything to come. Now, as we drove, he told me he'd done some research.
You ever heard of a town called Leith, North Dakota?
He asked. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I shook my head.
Back in 2012, a guy named Craig Cobb started buying up property in the tiny town of Leith,
Curtis explained.
While it wasn't clear at first, it soon became known that he was a white supremacist. His plan was to buy up a bunch of property, move all his racist friends there, and take over the town government. It would be a white utopia. They would have probably put up a sign that said, "Welcome to Leith, no coloreds allowed."
I shook my head, seeing where he was going with this.
Anyway, he continued, the people in Leith didn't want a bunch of Nazis taking over their town. In short, Cobb was arrested for terrorizing the citizens and was eventually prohibited from living anywhere near Leith. The guy was an idiot, even for a white supremacist. Okay,
I said.
I seem to remember hearing about this way back when. Are you saying that Raynor is like Leith? I'm saying that I did some research while on the plane, accessing public property records and digging into some of the names I found.
Curtis paused, looking at me through the gloomy interior of the vehicle.
And every single name I researched has low-key ties to the KKK.
I sat back in my seat, sighing.
Craig Cobb is a moron, but it seems that these people went about taking over this town much better than he did in Leith. They did it, and, looking at you, I can see why they didn't have a problem selling you a house. In their minds, no self-respecting white man would marry a person of a different race. They just assumed your family was white. So when they saw Viv and Trish, I guess they got pretty mad.
I shook my head.
It's so stupid. I'm not even all white. Yeah, but you look white. I guess that was enough.
Curtis turned onto the street that led to my house.
Listen,
he said.
I think we should all leave tonight. Go find a hotel somewhere. I don't think it's safe here.
I glanced at the clock.
It's so late already. We wouldn't get to a hotel before 2 in the morning. I think we'll stay for the night and then leave tomorrow. You're welcome to stay if you want.
As we turned down my driveway, Curtis sighed.
If you're gonna stay, I'll stay too. But I'm going to sit outside in the car, just in case. I didn't like the way the sheriff and his lackeys were looking at us. Not one bit.
I agreed, but now I wish I hadn't. I wish I'd taken Curtis's advice and left as soon as we got there, because they came just a couple of hours later, and they came in force. In the light cast by the bathroom's nightlight, I looked at my beautiful wife and daughter, their faces distorted by fear. Their normally rich, dark skin was ashen, save where tears had cut dark lines down their faces. Yes, I was afraid in that moment. Afraid they would come into the house and kill us. Afraid they would take away the two most important people in my life. But mostly I was mad. I was filled with a rage that ran so deep and so red, it seemed to create a halo of hate in my vision. But when I heard a crash that could only be the front door breaking in, the fear took over. I did nothing but cower in my own house, waiting for our attackers to come upstairs and do whatever they pleased to us. And then I remembered Curtis. In all the fear and terror, I'd forgotten that he had offered to stay outside. Suddenly jumping up and sweeping the shower curtain aside, I stepped into the tub and looked out the still intact bathroom window. It didn't take me long to see him in the pool of light from the floodlights above the garage. He was hanging from a tree by his neck, swinging back and forth, clearly dead. A man in a white hood stepped out from behind a tree and looked up at me. He had a rifle in his hands, and he aimed it up at the bathroom window. I ducked back just before he fired. The bullets shattered the glass and traveled into the ceiling. Vivian and Trisha screamed from the spot on the floor. The firing stopped, and I could hear them in my house. They were coming up the stairs. They were coming to kill us. The fear inside stayed, but the rage that had been there now tripled in intensity. The vision of my brother-in-law hanging lynched outside my house sent me into a kind of fugue state. I yanked the shower curtain rod down and pulled the two separate pieces apart. Then I crimped the circular edges down using the heel of my bare foot against the edge of the tub. Vivian looked up at me, a question in her eyes. But she said nothing as I stepped to the bathroom door with one of the metal tubes in my hand. I listened at the door, hearing the footsteps move down the hall toward the bathroom. With my right hand, I held the tube at eye level. With my left, I held the doorknob. It was an awkward position, but I knew that if they had guns, which I was pretty sure they did, I needed all the edge I could get. I held my breath as the footsteps came close to the door. And then, that rage flowing through me like some kind of powerful drug, I pulled the door open and threw the metal tube as hard as I could at the hooded man in the hall. The end of the tube struck him in the face, causing him to flinch back just as he pulled the trigger on his shotgun. The slug blasted a hole in the bathroom door, traveling high enough to miss my wife and daughter. I lunged out into the hall and grabbed the shotgun with both hands, slamming the man against the wall. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw another hooded figure coming up the stairs. Aiming the gun at the second figure with one hand, I reached for the trigger and pushed the man's finger down with my other. The shotgun fired, catching the second figure in the chest and sending him flying down the stairs. It only occurred to me later that I had no idea the shotgun was a semi-auto model. If it hadn't been, pulling the trigger would have done nothing without a new shell loaded in the chamber. I was lucky. The man with the shotgun forced me back against the opposite wall, next to the bathroom door, and got the shotgun across my neck. Something flashed in my vision, and the man's arm suddenly went limp. He stumbled back, metal shower curtain rod sticking out of his neck. Vivian had jammed the thing through the fabric of his hood and into the side of his neck. She pulled it out, and a gush of blood followed. The man dropped to the floor, leaving me holding the shotgun. My wife and I shared a look, and then I moved to the top of the stairs. I peered down to see Sheriff Walsh looking down at the man who'd taken a shotgun blast to the chest. The sheriff had taken both his hood off and the dead man's. I recognized the dead man as the young deputy. I was barefoot, which was probably why he hadn't heard me come to the top of the stairs. But he looked up to see me pointing the shotgun down at him. He opened his mouth to speak, but I didn't want to hear anything he had to say. I pulled the trigger. His face disappeared, replaced by a gory hole. By the time I cleared the first floor, I was fairly certain the rest of them had retreated. I moved outside cautiously, approaching the tree Curtis was still hanging from. No one appeared from the woods. I heard the distant sound of a couple of car engines firing up. I reached out and stilled Curtis's swinging body with a hand on his leg. And then the tears came. The FBI made quick work of the surviving assailants. The idiots had brought their phones with them, and the feds were able to tie the survivors and their weapons to the scene. We're still awaiting trial, but the prosecutor thinks it will be a slam dunk. They're accused of hate crimes and will likely get the maximum sentence possible. I found out later that the man my wife killed with the shower curtain rod was Buchanan, the real estate agent. The day after my family was attacked, the mayor of Raynor stuck a gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger, but it didn't do the job. He's now a vegetable that his wife must take care of. Call me cruel, but I think it's no more than they deserve. Too bad, so sad. My family soon sold the house and moved to a different small town. We've been welcomed by all the people so far, no matter their race, creed, or religion. And after that anti-American nightmare, we're now finally living the American dream. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out some more of my episodes here.